We are in the book of John, chapter 18. If I can find it. We're nearing the end of this particular study. We've got today and 4 Sundays in May, right? I think there's just 4 in May. So, closing out the quarter, closing out this study. Of course, as we pointed out in our introduction and several times throughout, John is going to, and we've seen that here, John really, in his account, he really puts on the brakes at the last week of Jesus' life. And there's a lot of detail, even in the account of the trial of Jesus. We've talked up to this point. I'm showing we left off at verse 12. So Jesus has gone over the brook Kedron. He's gone into Gethsemane. And then Judas arrives early in the chapter here with a band of men. And Jesus asks, "Whom seek ye?" And they tell him they're looking for Jesus. And he says, "I am." They go backwards. They fall to the ground. He asks them again. And then he says, "I've told you that I am, or I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which you spake of them which thou gavest me, have I lost none." The idea of losing to someone else taking them. Now, obviously, Judas chose of his own to go away. And sometimes we talk about this in the context of what is, the Calvinists would refer to it as perseverance of the saints. Most of us are more familiar with the other name that it goes by, once saved, always saved. And sometimes people, when they're teaching that, and it's not a biblical doctrine, but when they're trying to advocate that, they'll go to passages where Jesus says something like, no one can take them out of my hand. They'll never go astray or never be taken from me. Passages like that. And we talked about this in John chapter 10, so I'm not going to go and re-teach all that. But all that's just to say that that the devil can't take you away from the Lord. No one can take you away. But if you choose on your own, of your own volition, I'm going to turn my back on the Lord, I'm going to walk away, then you can do that, obviously. And so when he talks about that, the scripture, the saying might be fulfilled, "Of them which thou gavest me have I lost none." Of course, that was in his prayer in chapter 17. That's the reference. So Simon Peter had a sword. He drew it. He smote the high priest's servant, cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Again, we've mentioned this before in other contexts. I don't recall mentioning it in our last session here on John, but the different gospel writers give different details, and we understand these are not contradictions. These are not discrepancies. It's just the same as if you saw a particular event. Sometimes there are witnesses to, and maybe it's a traffic accident, maybe it's something else that happens, and so you take person A over here and you say, "Well, what happened?" And they may describe what happened, and then you take person B over here and you say, "What happened?" And it's the same event, and you can tell they're describing the same event, but they may give an extra detail. One person may say, "Well, these 2 cars were driving down here, and they collided, and it was a bad accident." And that may be all he says about it. You may have somebody else who says, there were these 2 cars out here. There was a red Ford and a blue Toyota, and they were coming. So there's not a contradiction. There's extra detail. So that's the way it is with the gospel writers. Sometimes there are different details given. Sometimes there are extra details. Sometimes there are fewer details. But we also understand that if you want to get all the details that God wants to reveal to us, you have to put them together, right? And you look at all 4 accounts, and Malchus is a good example of that. Peter, he drew a sword. He smote a servant of the high priest. His name was Malchus. He cut off his right ear. And we pointed out before, he wasn't going for the ear. He's striking to try to at least seriously injure, if not kill this person. And Jesus, of course, tells him to put up his sword. But all these details coming together, and again, that's just to point out that as the psalmist says, the sum, S-U-M, of thy word is truth. And so whether you're talking about this event there in the garden when they came to arrest Jesus, or whether you're talking about what a person has to do to become a Christian, you have to take all of Revelation, right? And you have to put it together to get a composite picture. Sometimes people, and we can do this on any subject, and we need to be careful about it because it happens sometimes even with Christians. But you go on a particular subject and you look at one verse, and if that's all the Bible had to say about it, it'd be one thing. But when the Bible has more to say about it, you've got to take that into consideration. And it never ceases to amaze me. Sometimes in a religious discussion with someone, they can find a verse that says something and just key in on that and say, well, that's what the verse says. You don't believe that verse? Well, of course I believe it. But I believe everything God has said on the matter, not just a single verse or two. So, good illustration of that right here with these details around this servant of the high priest named Malchus, who lost his right ear, at least temporarily. Then said Jesus unto Peter, verse 11, put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? Then the band of the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus, and they bound him, and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now, it's interesting because Jesus, he asked, who are you seeking? They say Jesus. He says, I'm he. And he tells them, take me. He surrenders himself to them. Of course, this is why he came to earth anyways. This is no big shock to him. This is why he came to earth, to die for mankind. And so he surrenders himself to them, but what do? They bind his hands. Now we sing that song, they bound the hands of Jesus in the garden where he prayed. They bind his hands, which is, of course, kind of ironic because you talk about interesting, binding the hands of God on earth. What good is that going to do you? I mean, you think about Samson. One time they bound him, and he gets up and it was like it was nothing. If that's the case for a mere mortal, and of course Samson had miraculous strength from God, but how much more so for the God of heaven and earth, who's simply tabernacling for a while, a short while, in human flesh. But that wasn't his will. He was submitting himself to the will of the Father, and the Father's will was that he should go to the cross. And so that's what he's going to do. But it's interesting to me that he surrenders himself to them. They still decide to bind him. They had seen the miracles. Did they really think that if he wanted to get out of that he could not have done so? I mean, but anyway, there's so many things sometimes when you're reading the gospel accounts and people seeing miracle after miracle and they refuse to believe it. Even here, make sure you tie him up real tight. We don't want him getting loose. Seriously. So they bind his hands and they take him to Annas. Now, this deserves mention because sometimes this is a question that comes up, Annas, Caiaphas. Annas had been high priest from somewhere around 7 to 14, AD 7 to 14. Annas was deposed by the procurator, Gratus. Caiaphas was son-in-law of Annas and successor to him. By the way, Luke gives both names. One is the rightful, the other is the acting high priest. There were so many Gentile interventions, and I don't know if you remember this. I know it's been several weeks, and sometimes I sleep and I can't remember what I preached, the night before or 2 days before. But in our sermon on the intertestamental period, I don't know. There was so much to cover that I can't remember. I don't think we covered it very well. We may have just touched on it. But that was one of the things during that period, during that time period between the testaments. There was a lot of upheaval in, there was this battle between the purists that want to stay true to all the Jewish traditions and they want to go strictly by the Jewish scriptures. And then there were these people, we would call them kind of the liberals that, lighten up, man. We need to get with the times and we want to be more Hellenistic, more like the Greeks. Alexander, he spread that Greek influence all over the empire. And even after Alexander was long gone, that influence lived on. And So there were these Jews that said, we need to relax. We need to become more like these Greeks that are around us. and many of them did. But this even got to the point that some of that liberal idea crept even into the high priest office. And you had the Syrians. You remember Antiochus? There were several Antiochus. I always forget if it's the third or the fourth. I think it's Antiochus the fourth, who was Antiochus Epiphanes, the Jews called it Epimanes, which was Antiochus the madman. He called himself Epiphanes, which was kind of the exalted one. He thought of himself as a god. But he and others, they would basically sell the high priest office to the highest bidder. And sometimes I can't remember if it was that particular Antiochus, but there was one, I know, that this fella in Jerusalem comes and he basically says to him, I'll give you more money. And he says, well, hey, guess what? You're the high priest. And not only that, he says, I'll give you more money, and we're going to become more like you Greek folk, Hellenistic people. We're going to become more Hellenistic. And so, they would play up to whoever was in charge. Don't you think, they knew that he wanted to Hellenize the Jews. And so here comes a fellow along, and he says, hey, I think we should be more Hellenistic too. I could give you some money here, and maybe you put me in charge as the high priest over the Jews. And so it became just really a token office. When you go into Genesis, well, not Genesis, but Exodus after Mount Sinai, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and early on in the Old Testament history of the Jews, the high priest was pretty important, and it was a very sacred office. By this time, the time of Jesus, it's pretty much a political thing. You pay the most, you get the most influence, you play up to the right leader and get him to put you in charge, and you'll be the high priest. But it was not the succession from Aaron like it had been before, which of course was broken anyways because Eli didn't discipline his children, as you recall, and the priestly line ended with him. God changed it. So it had some changes along the way, but there was a succession there. But that is long gone. And so sometimes these Roman procurators would come along, or some Roman person in charge, even, again, going back to between the Testaments, sometimes it was a Syrian person who was in charge. And they'd just say, for whatever reason, they didn't like this person. And usually it was because this person would dare to challenge them or say you're doing something wrong. And so they'd say, guess what? You're not high priest anymore. So that's why you have two different high priests here in this section. One fellow said it was in the last 107 years of the temple's existence. This will be before AD 70. So in the last about 107 years, there were no less than 28 high priests. That tells you something about how it changed hands constantly. Luke fixes the time when Jesus began his ministry, locating it by emperor, by governor, by tetrarch, and by high priest. And also, of course, fixing it as an event of worldwide importance, which it remains, of course, to this day. And it's of concern to all the kingdoms of men. So you've got the tetrarch, you've got the high priest, you've got the governor of Judea, you've got the ruler of the entire known world at that time. So Luke fixes it from that sense. But that's why you see Annas and Caiaphas here. Now, Annas and Caiaphas, of course, they're related. Which one was son-in-law? I always forget. Annas was father-in-law to Caiaphas, verse 13 tells us. And so they played nice together. You've got Caiaphas, who has now been made by the Romans the, quote, true high priest. But he's going to play nice with Annas because Annas is, it's his father-in-law, and he's kind of, I've used the illustration before, he's kind of like the Godfather. They're not going to do anything without his approval because he's very well respected by the Jews. If I remember correctly, I don't have this here, but if I remember correctly, Annas was the rightful high priest at that time. And so again, that's another reason they're playing nice together, because he knows and the people know he's the rightful high priest. But hey, the Romans have put you in charge, so I'm in charge, but we'll just get along and go along to get along, as they say. But that's why you see those two different folks listed here. Now it says, Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Now, you remember earlier that they said, some of the Jews said, what are we going to do? This man, he does many miracles. That's one of those head scratchers that every time I read it and every time I study this book, I just, again, people can be stubborn, they can be hard-hearted, but these people, they say he's doing many miracles. It's not, he's fooling the people. We got to figure out what his trick is. He's pulling some really, really good sleight of hand here or trickery. No, they acknowledge he's doing many miracles. And their question is, what are we going to do? And that there's a sermon in that somewhere. Jesus is a man who did many miracles. What are you going to do with him? They determine, the logical answer there is, what are we going to do? Believe on him. Follow him. Because obviously, this man who you just admitted is doing many miracles is God in the flesh. But they don't do that. They say, what are we going to do about this situation? And so, of course, Caiaphas stood up and gave that prophecy, not because he thought to himself, oh, I'm going to give a prophecy. He's giving this prophecy unbeknownst to himself that someone is going to die for the people. Now, you shift gears a little bit at verse 15, and it's going to shift to following Simon Peter, or Peter as we often refer to him. He followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That another disciple would be John, the human author, the human penman of this gospel account. That disciple, John, was known unto the high priest. John knew the high priest, went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. It seems that John is going to get further access, further inside of the high priest's household than does Peter. One fellow said there's another great sermon here. I've never preached it, never put one together, but I think there is a sermon about following Jesus at a distance, and that's kind of what you see here. And sometimes to this day, people want to follow Jesus at a distance, don't they? I want to follow Jesus, but not too closely. I'll just keep my distance. And that's sort of some people's mentality. But he's following from a distance. Simon Peter's following. Again, John is that another disciple, and he's going to get a little further inside. Peter stood at the door without or outside. Then went out that other disciple, John, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Well, apparently, John had enough of a connection. He says, hey, tell that, we don't know any details. What did he tell her that they invited Peter inside? I don't know. But whatever it was, they bring Peter inside. Then said the damsel, here's Peter's betrayal and denial. Then said the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. Well, she John says whatever he says, and she goes, oh, okay, you want me to let that guy in? She goes, and you could just kind of see her go, wait a minute. You're one of that guy's disciples, right? And Peter says, no, I don't think so. Got the wrong guy. And it's interesting that in the garden, very early, right here in chapter 18, they come, and Jesus says, whom seek ye? And they said, we're looking for Jesus. What did Jesus say? What was his response? I am. I am he. The he is italicized. Literally, he says, I am. The lady says to Peter, you're one of his disciples, right? And Peter says what? I am not. I don't think I'd ever noticed that. It was in a fellow's notes that one of my friends had given me that he took in preaching school. I don't think I'd ever really, I don't know, maybe I'm making too much of that, but that's pretty interesting to me. That puts that denial in a whole different context. It was still, it's always been a denial is a denial, but here's Jesus, he says, I am. Peter says, oh, no, I am not one of his disciples. It's the exact opposite. That's But anyway, he denies him the first time. One of the servants of the high priest, verse 26, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, saith, did not I see thee in the garden with him? You know, he's thinking, I know this guy from somewhere. Hey, didn't I see you in the garden with him? You know, she says, are you not one of his disciples? No, not me. And another guy comes along and says, yeah, I saw you in the garden with him. Peter denied again. Then the cock crew. Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early. They themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Peter, of course, John doesn't spend as much time on Peter's denial as some of the other writers, but he denies Jesus, and of course, you have, I'm just drawing a blank. I want to say it's Matthew or Mark, but one of the other writers records how that Jesus, at the third denial, he looked on Peter. And I cannot imagine having just denied with cursing and swearing that you even know the man, to turn and to lock eyes with whom you knew to be the Son of God. Is it any wonder that Peter went out and, as the Bible says, he wept bitterly? Can you imagine first saying, no, I'm not one of his disciples. You got me mixed up with somebody else. Another person comes along and says, yeah, I saw you with him in the garden. No, I know. What are you talking about? I'm not one of his disciples. Another one comes along and says, yeah, you're a Galilean. Your speech agrees with it. I can tell by how you talk. And he begins to curse and to swear. And then he just so happens to turn and he locks eyes with Jesus. I heard one person say, I don't know, it's speculation because the Bible doesn't say, but he said, could you imagine if at that moment he looked at Jesus and Jesus just mouthed the word, remember? And so Peter, he goes out and he wept bitterly. And again, no wonder. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah.
He doesn't have a clue what everything that we built all of these years on, I don't understand it because I'm watching him bind his hands to it. But now wait a minute. People say Peter denied Jesus. He didn't want to have anything to do with him. But he never loses lockstep with where he's going. And he can't get close enough. He's still trying to figure out what in the world is going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's something, not to justify the denial, but, you know, it may be that he's trying just to do whatever, like you said, to keep close and see what's he going to say, what's he going to do. Maybe he's still holding out hope that Jesus is going to, you know, explode the high priest house or something and take over. I don't know, but I think it's clear. You're dealing with a man who's very confused. Maybe the whipping out the sword is to, hey, I got to get Jesus into action here. You know, he'd already told him at one occasion, no, you're not going to die. And of course, Jesus said, get thee behind me, Satan. So there's a lot of misunderstanding among the disciples and particularly the apostles. But Jesus, Peter rather, is a man that sometimes I've heard This is one of those that I want to put together one of these days. I've never put together the sermon. I've got it in kind of my starter notes. But it's a sermon called Willing to Die, but Not Willing to Live. And sometimes, here's Peter, he's willing to whip out his sword and try to kill somebody, and maybe he's trying to spur Jesus into action himself. Maybe that's how he viewed it. But then sometimes we can be like that, right? We're willing to die for the Lord, but what about just the day-to-day Christianity? And so Peter denies Jesus. And again, it's no wonder he wept, because he remembered what Jesus had said. No doubt he remembered how vehemently he had denied that. No, Jesus, I will die for you before I would ever deny you. And Jesus says, before the cock crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. It's also interesting, by the way, just I don't want to get too far off course, but I do want to notice something here. Go to Mark's gospel account. Tonight is our book of the month, looking at the book of Mark. And Mark has been called by some of the early Christian writers as the memoirs of Peter, or the gospel account of Peter. Tradition says, it's not known for sure, but tradition says that Mark traveled extensively with Peter, was probably a convert of Peter, that he was a translator for him. And so if that's the case, he no doubt wrote a lot of things as Peter's recording to them, not taking away the inspiration of it. Obviously, the inspiration of the Holy Spirit is the overarching guide there, but and some sources even say that Mark had Peter read over his gospel account as if to say, you were with the man, tell me, make sure I've got everything right here. I don't know about that, because, again, there's the inspiration of the Spirit that's going to make sure that nothing is wrong, but I think it's very likely, highly likely, that he wrote this right alongside Peter, maybe compiling things that he heard Peter talk about in sermons or just in private conversations as he's traveling with Peter. But it's interesting, at the resurrection, look at Mark 16. This, to me, has to be one of the most encouraging things, because I dare say most, if not all of us, have had what I would call a Simon Peter moment, where you blew it. You messed up big time, and you knew it, and you're sick over it, and maybe, as Roger was talking about Thursday night, maybe not to minimize sin, but you're beating yourself up so badly over it. And I dare say that's probably how Peter felt after this. But look at Mark 16 and notice verse 7. There's this angel speaking to the women as they come to the tomb, but he says, go your way, tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee. There shall you see him, as he said unto you. Was Peter a disciple? Of course he was, right? Why not just say, go tell the disciples? Why call Peter by name there? Peter, it's going to be okay. Yes, you messed up, but there's hope. I love that verse. And Mark is the only gospel account that records that. And again, if there's that influence from Peter, no doubt Peter wanted to bring that out, that, hey, he had a special message for me. Not because he's being prideful, but he's showing whatever you've done, God wants to forgive you. He wants you to make things right. And notice, go forward just a little bit to Luke's resurrection account. In Luke 24, we often talk about it, and again, I know I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, and y'all may have to remind me when we get to John 21 so I don't reteach the same material over again. But I love this part of the whole narrative about the crucifixion, because we'll cover this again in John 21 from a different perspective. Everybody thinks about that, Jesus asking Peter 3 times, "Do you love me? Feed my sheep." I think in John 21 he's restoring him maybe publicly to the office of, maybe to the, I don't know if it's the best terminology, but for lack of a better term, to the office of an apostle. But Peter, the man, personally, that seems to happen differently, away from all the others. Because look at Luke 24. And let's look at, get the right verse. I keep turning 2 pages at once. 24. 33 says, they rose up the same hour and returned to Jerusalem. This is the guys who were walking to Emmaus. Found the 11 gathered together and them that were with them, saying, "The Lord is risen indeed and hath appeared to Simon." That's Peter. And that goes well with, let me get the exact wording of it. In 1 Corinthians, Paul mentions this as well. If I can find the verse. 5. Verse 4, 1 Corinthians 15:4. He was buried, rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. Now, some people try to make that out like Jesus is putting Simon Peter in charge of the apostles or something. No, we know that from other passages. If nothing else, Galatians 2, where Paul had to rebuke Peter to the face because he was to be blamed. What this is, though, is this is Jesus appearing to him separately, and he's restoring him personally, individually. Peter messed up. He messed up big time. But Jesus is restoring him, letting him know, as we talked about Thursday night in the sermon, yes, Peter, your life is in a mess right now. But you're not the first. You've got a future. And then later on, he's going to say, your future, should you choose to accept it, is to go and feed my sheep. You're back in the fold, so to speak, individually, but you're also back as an apostle. What a contrast between Peter and Judas, right? Judas could have had that, but he didn't seek it. Peter wanted reconciliation. He sought reconciliation. And what a great thought to know that even when I mess up, and I mess up big time, Jesus sends that message. You go tell the apostles and Peter, and I'm going to Galilee and I'm going to meet you there. And then he appears to Peter as if to say, you're going to be okay. All is forgiven. And that is just a tremendous thought from this text. And that's available for us as well. Let's go on in chapter 18, getting back to John chapter 18. Every time I think about Peter's denial, I'm reminded of that and the forgiveness that you see. A lot of folks might be tempted to say, you're not going to be, I'll forgive you, but an apostle? You think you're going to be an apostle still after that? After you denied me 3 times and the third time with cursing and swearing? I don't think so. I mean, that's what a lot of mere humans would say there. The God of heaven says, no, going to be restored, Peter, individually, but also to that particular office with the special work that those apostles carried forth. Now, where did we leave off? 28? Yeah, they lead Jesus from Caiaphas into the hall of judgment. Court, yes, sir.
Are we going to skip over 19 through 24? Did you do that on purpose?
I did, didn't I?
Well, there's some powerful stuff. I thought we were going to skip that.
I don't know what I did there. I guess I went over to the other page because. Well, I was thinking if I hurry, I could finish the chapter. I guess that's not going to happen now. I don't know what I was doing. I guess I was covering Peter's denial, and I just skipped down. Sorry about that. I'm just trying to figure out how I managed that. But yes, all right, let's go there. Warming yourself by the enemy's fire. I knew I had that in my notes, and I just had missed that too. Verse 18, Peter says, I am not. We talked about that. Boy, I don't know. It's just one of those moments. Thank you. So the servants of the officers, verse 18, stood there. They'd made a fire of coals, for it was cold. They warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. And you know, that again, there's that concept that I've heard sermons on, warming yourself by the enemy's fire. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. He's probably asking Jesus about his disciples and about his doctrine, trying to trump up charges. They have nothing. They had tried in the week leading up to his arrest, leading up to the Passover here. They've sent different people to him. They've sent a lawyer, not as lawyers we would think about it, someone who was an expert in the law of Moses. They sent lawyers, scribes, Pharisees tried, Sadducees tried. I mean, all these different people, they try to catch him in his speech. Oh, should we pay taxes to Caesar? We got him now, because if he says no, man, the Romans are going to be all over him. And if he says yes, then the people are going to hate him for that, because the people hated paying taxes, just like anybody does. And so, Jesus says, show me a coin. Whose image is it? It's Caesar's. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Render to God the things that are God's. Oops, we didn't get him on that one, man. That was pretty good. The Sadducees say, he believes in the resurrection. We don't believe in the resurrection. So they come up with this scenario. Here's a woman, and she married a man, and he died. And so his brother married her to raise up seed in his brother's name, and then he died. And then another brother, and another, and another, and another. 7 brothers had her to wife. Oh, Jesus, you believe in the resurrection. Whose is she going to be in the resurrection? And Jesus says, what? You do err, not knowing the scriptures of the power of God. And so over and over again, they think they've got him. And they don't. And so here again, the high priest is going to try to catch him in his words. That's what, I think it was Matthew that uses that account. They try to catch him or entangle him in his speech. But they didn't do it before. They're not going to do it now, because Jesus, everything he speaks is true and right, and so there's no contradiction, there's no problem with anything there. And so Jesus' answer is, they say, tell us about your disciples, tell us about your doctrine. And Jesus says, I spake openly to the world. My doctrine is no secret. I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. And then he says, why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I have said. You want to know my doctrine? Ask the ones I taught. I didn't teach in secret. I taught out in the public. You remember one time he fed 5,000, another time he fed 4,000, because they were all gathered around to hear him preach. He spoke in the temple. He spoke in the synagogue. Crowds followed him wherever he went. It was no secret what he taught. And so he knows they're asking a very dishonest question. Tell us about your doctrine, Jesus. They don't want to know about his doctrine. They're trying to entangle him. And he says, why don't you just ask anybody who's standing here? I could just see him kind of motioning to the crowd. You folks that are right here right now, you know what I taught. It's not a secret. And when he had thus spoken, verse 22 says, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, answerest thou the high priest so? Striking the Son of God on earth in the face. Very insulting gesture. And of course, Jesus' response is, verse 23, if I've spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? If I said something wrong, why don't you tell me what I said wrong? But if not, why are you striking me? As we always say, deity never asks a question for information. Jesus is trying to get them to see you didn't do right here. And they knew that. Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest. Again, this is Annas and Caiaphas playing nice together. Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. They said therefore unto him, art not thou also one of his disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. Oh, I skipped one I am not to the other. I just figured out how I did that. Well, we're out of time there. We'll stop there. I appreciate that, Tim. I would have skipped right over that. That is some great material right in those few verses, and I apologize for getting off. But we covered the denial of Peter, so what we'll do, Lord willing, next week we'll pick up at verse 28 and talk about the irony, the utter hypocrisy of the Jews not going into the judgment hall or praetorium, as Mark gives us the account. They're not going to go into the judgment hall because they don't want to be defiled. They have taken the Son of God and they've arrested him, and they're going to move Pilate to kill him, but they don't want to be defiled. How ironic, isn't it? We'll pick up there, good Lord willing, next Sunday, be May the 7th, right? Thank you very much for your time and attention. We'll have just a short break before our worship period.